the transportation master plan this round in bringing an equity lens, but as we update those other key plans, we need to make sure that equity is front and center. So that's the concept there. The last two here were suggestions from Councilmember Fincher. Council members are aware that on our agenda bills or motion sheets, there's a line for the budget impact and also a line for the strategic plan goal.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Kent City Council Committee of the Whole meeting. Today is Tuesday, October 13th. This is a remote meeting due to the COVID-19 restrictions put in place by the governor. Welcome to anyone that is watching us on Kent TV 21, the City of Kent Facebook channel, and the Kent YouTube Kent TV 21 channel. And then again, anyone else that's dialing in. So welcome to this afternoon's meeting. We do have a very full agenda, so I'd like to get started. Kim, can you please call the roll?
Council President Troutner.
Here.
Councilmember Boyce.
Here.
Councilmember Fincher.
Here.
Councilmember Kaur.
Here.
Councilmember Larmer.
Here.
Councilmember Michaud.
Here.
Councilmember Thomas.
Here.
And the mayor is also in attendance. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Kim. Are there any changes to the agenda from council or staff?
None from staff this afternoon.
All right, seeing none, if I can have an approval of the agenda, please. Actually, I guess we don't have to take action on that. Sorry, we'll move on. Since this is just a committee meeting, let's move on to department presentations. And I would like to welcome Briahna Murray. I think, Derek, you might step in at some point. I don't know who's going to go first, but let's talk about the state legislative agenda for 2021.
All right, and I'm happy to defer to Briahna.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I am going to share my screen and pull up a PowerPoint presentation for today's discussion. Can you all see this?
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
we can.
Excellent. Okay, I have a lot of material to cover this afternoon, so I am going to dive right in so we can be efficient with our time. This afternoon, I'm hoping to provide you all with some background on what to expect during the 2021 legislative session, and then review with you a draft legislative agenda and policy document and answer any questions and get your feedback and discussion on it. I'm going to dive right into providing some background on what to expect this upcoming legislative session. I want to start first by talking about a special session. There was a lot of activity in the media earlier this year regarding the convening of a special session in advance of the 2021 regular legislative session. At this point in time, it's seeming that a special session is highly unlikely and that the legislature will wait until January to convene in their regular legislative session. And that will occur on January 11th of 2021. It is the first year of the two-year legislative biennium, which means it is a budget year and a long legislative session. So they will convene for 105 days. At this point, the format of the session is looking to be most likely to be virtual. There will likely be some in-person elements to the session. They will need to convene in person in order to change their procedural rules. And there's still some uncertainty over how they will vote in a virtual format. However, most committee meetings are currently being held virtual, and they'll likely to continue to be held virtual throughout the legislative session. Democrats are expected to maintain the majority in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. It is possible they may even increase their majority in both chambers. We'll know, of course, the outcome of that following this November's elections. Because it is a long legislative session and a budget year, the legislature will be focusing their time on the development of an operating, capital, and transportation budget. There are revenue shortfalls in 2 of those 3 budgets, which we'll go into greater detail on in a moment. In addition to focusing on their budget development, they will be looking at several different policy bills. There are some that are beginning to emerge that we know will be hot topics. One of those is police reform. Another is housing and rental assistance in light of impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic. Another would be racial equity. Then we're anticipating a whole slew of bills that really are focused on the pandemic response. And that is everything from technical changes that they realize they now need in law to some of the more pressing or controversial issues around how much authority the governor should have during a pandemic. I will note that if the legislative session is held virtually, which seems likely, that the ability for the legislature to consider as many bills as they have historically is much less. So we're expecting to see fewer bills introduced and even fewer bills that are able to be passed into law. I want to spend a little bit more time on the budgets that the legislature will be developing. So the legislature has three different budgets: an operating budget, a capital budget, and a transportation budget. The operating budget funds all state agency operations, including the K through 12 education system. This is the budget that you read about most in the media. Earlier this year, it was anticipated that this budget was going to be facing a $7 billion revenue shortfall. But recent revenue forecast numbers have been more positive. So that shortfall is now looking to be just under $4 billion. The state does have a rainy day fund account for this budget that has approximately $3 billion within that account. So the state could utilize the rainy day fund to balance that $4 billion revenue shortfall. Additionally, budget writers have said they're anxiously awaiting to see what the federal government chooses to do on federal assistance. They're hopeful that the federal government will approve another round of assistance and that additional money from the federal government could help balance that revenue shortfall. Depending on how revenue forecasts come in and whether or not there is additional federal assistance, they will be looking at budget cuts. However, Democrats have indicated that they do not want to do an all cuts budget. So if there is a revenue shortfall that would necessitate budget cuts, we expect they will also be looking at new revenue or new tax proposals in order to balance that budget. New revenue could look like a capital gains tax, it could look like an income tax, could look like an increase in sin taxes such as marijuana and liquor taxes. It could also look like a new statewide payroll tax that could be modeled off of some of the proposals we saw last session. All of those discussions are up in the air at this point, but that should give you a flavor of what we're expecting within that budget discussion. The second budget that they're going to work on is the capital budget. This is a budget that funds public and nonprofit construction projects. It does not include transportation budgets. So while you all at the city level combine capital improvements with transportation improvements, the legislature separates those two out. And the capital budget is funded by bonds that a percentage of the operating budget are dedicated to pay off each year. We're anticipating this budget to be $2.5 to $3 billion. And legislators are indicating that they're hoping to take this money and target those investments into projects that will stimulate the economy or support vulnerable populations or areas of our society that have not received as significant of investments out of this budget in the past. The third budget is the transportation budget, and the transportation budget was facing a fairly significant revenue shortfall prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. The voters approved Initiative 976 in November of 2019, which reduced car tabs to $30 and created a fairly significant revenue shortfall within the 21-23 transportation budget. That initiative is currently in the court system, and it's unclear when we'll get resolution on whether or not it can be upheld. Meanwhile, that revenue shortfall got greater through the COVID-19 pandemic. The states collected fewer gas tax revenues as well as fewer toll revenues throughout the pandemic, making that shortfall quite significant. So that has prompted, both of those actions have prompted discussions around the development of a transportation revenue package. Those revenue package discussions began in 2019 They continued throughout the 2020 legislative session. And I would say in the last few months, they have continued with even greater momentum and earnest. It's very evident that the conversation around a transportation revenue package will be linked to climate policy. So as they're looking at different revenue sources for the next revenue package, they're considering things like a carbon tax and a cap and trade system, as well as a low carbon fuel standard. It's unclear how all of those will come together, but I wanted to flag for you that they're being far more broad than just simply looking at another gas tax increase to fund the next revenue package. The specific revenue force is yet to be identified.
Councilmember Thomas, you have your hand up. Did you have a question? Oh, you're muted. Oh.
I think still muted.
There it goes.
There you
Thank
go.
you. Thank you, Madam President. Sorry for that. No, I have an idea what the question and the answer was already. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Okay, well that concludes a summary of the budget work and some background on the budget work that the legislature is likely to undertake this next session. I'd like to transition to talking about the city's legislative priorities. And before what I'm going to do is wrap up the PowerPoint slide and then pull up the draft of the legislative priorities document. But before I do that, I want to just offer for your thought and consideration some guidance on the development of your legislative agenda. The legislative priorities really are your direction as a city to me on the items that you would like me to spend my time and energy on, as well as the items that you would like put front and center in front of your legislative delegation. Given the virtual format of this legislative session, I am encouraging all of my clients, and I encourage you all to be hyper-focused in your legislative priorities. And in the draft that we're going to review today, I do believe that we're putting forward something that is hyper-focused. Essentially, the bandwidth to take on dozens of different policy issues is far more limited this year than we see in other years. For all of those other issues, though, that are discussed, I want to make sure that we have your positions captured and that you have provided direction on those issues. So in addition to your top legislative priorities, we have a policy document. And that policy document includes all of those additional issues that may come up. It tends to be items that we're going to be more reactive on rather than proactive. Is something that we can update each year from year to year. And so we've had this policy document in previous years. We're carrying over a lot of the policies that we've seen discussed in previous legislative sessions to make sure we are consistent from year to year. I'm encouraging you to focus on capital and transportation budget requests. As we just went over, those are the areas where there are funding opportunities. The funding opportunities within the transportation budget are dependent on the development of a revenue package, but there are opportunities in those two budgets, whereas there are less opportunities on the operating budget. Also encourage you to focus on city-specific issues where the city weighing in or serving as quarterback on an issue, the lead actor that's moving issues forward, is the best use of our political capital. And to take into account the current political environment, acknowledge that Democrats are likely to be in control of both chambers and that they're going to be struggling with some different budgetary challenges within the operating budget. I have also encouraged you to be consistent with previous legislative agendas and legislative efforts. Oftentimes, it takes several years of advocacy to accomplish a legislative priority, and so we want to build on some of our previous efforts. So that's my general guidance for you all to think about as we transition to looking at your draft legislative priorities. So I'm going to close out the PowerPoint and bring up the draft legislative priorities document. I'll just share that in developing this draft document, I met with each of the departments and the mayor's office to get feedback and really tried to bring the principles that I just outlined into this document. We have adjusted some of our language of some of the items that we've worked on in previous years to make them more politically on point and with messaging that I think will be well received by legislators. In addition to this legislative priority document, in your packet, you have one-pagers that expand upon many of these top priority items. So with that, I'm going to walk through each of the legislative priorities, and then for the policy document, I'll bring that up afterward. We're not going to walk through each item in the policy document, but I'll bring that up and answer any questions that you might have about issues that are captured in that policy document. So again, these are the recommended legislative priorities. These are the top priority issues that you would want me spending the bulk of my time and energy on, and that we're really going to present to our legislative delegation is where we would like them to spend their time and energy on as well. The first item is on social justice reform. And as I mentioned, this is a hot topic that the legislature is going to consider this session. We've heard that there are over 60 different proposals on equity and police reform. This is a broad statement directing me to engage in all of those proposals, and then specifically calls out that the city would like the legislature to fund mental health professionals to work alongside police officers, would like the legislature to establish a standardized use of force reporting requirements, to fund data collection from law enforcement agencies to identify and address racial disparity, and to allocate funding to ensure improved communication and access to government for non-English speaking individuals. Those are all concepts that are being discussed as part of the many different proposals that the legislature is considering. So we're flagging for our legislators that those specific items are ones out of those 60 that we would really like to see them prioritize. And I would spend more time on those specific items listed than the broad array of issues that are being discussed. I'll also share that among our legislative delegation, Representative Entenman and Representative Orwell have been involved in several of those specific proposals. So we will be working very closely with our local legislators on those specific items.
Briahna, can I just interrupt for a quick second? As we have questions that come up, how do you want me to handle them? Do you want to wait until we get through the priorities, or if someone has a question, do you want to take it as we go through the process?
I think on the legislative priorities, it makes sense to take them as we go. And so I think if there are questions on the social justice reform specifically, let's take that now. And then if there are more broad statements, we can take that at the end.
Perfect, that makes sense. So I see Councilmember Corey, you have your hand raised.
Thank you, Briahna. My question is, what does the bills on allocated funding to ensure improved communication and access to government for non-English speaking individuals look like? What exactly is in those bills?
Great question. I don't have an answer for you on that because so many of these bills are currently under development, so there really aren't specifics being shared at this time. There's this sort of broad list of over 60 proposals. Very few have been winnowed down into draft form. That being said, like the standardized use of force reporting requirements, we have seen a couple different bill drafts on that and a couple different approaches, but I don't have a specific bill draft on improved communication and access to government for non-English speaking individuals.
I'd like to know more when you have some information on that, please.
Sure,
Thank
yeah.
you.
So on all of these items, as I get more information, once the legislative priorities are confirmed, then you guys will get continual updates on each of these items in your weekly reports from me as we get closer to the legislative session.
Thank you. And I see Councilmember Boyce, you have your hand raised as well.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Hi, Briahna. Do you know, as far as I mean, I know a little about SCA, but AWC, are they in line with like, let's take the social justice, where are they at with that for their priorities?
Yeah, AWC has developed a police reform agenda, and it includes several different items. Some of them overlap with the items we have specifically called out here, but not all of them. So the ones that overlap include funding mental health professionals to work along police officers. They're supporting a proposal to establish a standardized use of force. So that's a slight variation from the reporting requirements. And I think those are the two where these specific items overlap with AWC.
Just one follow-up. I know you don't have a crystal ball, right? But I'm just curious about, there's a sense of urgency around this social justice reform, and you've been around long enough. There seems to be a lot of push for this. And what did your gut feeling tell you about something that's going to happen with this year?
Yes, I think that the legislature is likely to pass a handful to a dozen, so somewhere between 6 and 12 bills, making progress in this arena. I also think there will be several different budget allocations to move work forward for future legislative proposals. I think there are some proposals that are more politically viable or more fully baked than others. And so we'll start to see those rise to the top. I have a sense of maybe what one or two of those are at this point, but not a good sense of exactly which 6 to 12 bills will be advancing forward. I would think by the time we get to mid-December that will become increasingly clear.
I think the key with all this here is the funding piece, right? So I'm hoping that, they say, yes, this is good, but you cities go and fund this year. So as you move forward, I think it's key that, the city's already strapping. So I'm hoping that it's something that the state will allocate or pay for to make sure it can be implemented.
Yeah, I do think there's a recognition amongst many state legislators that they can't simply pass additional responsibilities onto cities and expect cities to find the funds to pay for additional responsibilities. The state will need to be a funding partner in those efforts, and they seem to acknowledge that.
Great, thanks, Briahna. I don't see any other hands raised at this point, so I think we can move on.
Okay, so moving on to the next item, which is streamlined sales tax mitigation. This is one that you are all familiar with. As a reminder, last legislative session, the legislature approved a bill that would have continued mitigation payments for an additional 6 years. However, the governor vetoed that bill in an effort to save funds in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our ask this next legislative session would be to restore funding to the program, both retroactively through the 1921 biennium, as well as into the 21-23 biennium. I will note that streamlined sales tax mitigation payments are funded out of the operating budget, which is the operating budget that's facing a $4 billion revenue shortfall. That being said, we have talked about this issue with each member of our legislative delegation, and they have all agreed to make this request and are willing to advocate for restoration of this funding. If federal funding is granted, depending on when the federal funding is approved and what strings are attached to it, it is possible that the state could allocate federal funding to backfill the mitigation payments that were vetoed. So there's, I guess my message to you all on this particular item is that it is going to be a challenging request to move forward in light of the state's budget situation. That being said, our legislators are encouraging us to continue to make the case for streamlined sales tax mitigation. In your packets is a one-pager that outlines some updated messaging on the streamlined sales tax mitigation program and how we'd like to message it moving into this next session in light of the current political climate. I encourage you all to look at that one-pager, and you can get back to me offline if you have any thoughts or feedback on the messaging that we're putting forward to be successful this next session. Any questions on that item?
I think we're good. Thanks, Briahna.
Okay, so the final item is really asking our legislators and the state legislature to invest in Kent. And so this is our list of capital and transportation funding requests. We've broken it into 3 different areas: enhancing the quality of life in Kent, supporting local downtown businesses, and enhancing the manufacturing center. So we're really trying to help our legislators see that these capital and transportation requests are much more about just one project here or there, but they really are about making improvements to the overall Kent community. So the first one under quality of life is a $3 million request for the Panther Lake Community Park. The project will develop and provide access to 30+ acres in the Panther Lake community of nearly 25,000 residents. This park is located within 4 miles of 7 different schools and is an area that doesn't otherwise have park amenities. We brought this request forward last legislative session, recognizing that there were not very many funding opportunities in a non-budget year. So we started to sort of pave the way for bringing this request forward in 2021. The second item under quality of life is around housing and finding a place to live. We're really encouraging our legislators to work with us in partnership to preserve and enhance housing for our residents. Highlighted here that the city is participating in a regional housing action strategy, that you all have adopted an updated multifamily property tax exemption program, enacted the local option sales tax in 1590, and are focused on providing a diversity of housing options to improve affordability and preserve housing. I will note that in addition to this broad statement, we have called out some specific items within the policy document that are within the area of housing. So you'll see in the policy document support for rent, mortgage, and utility assistance through COVID, support for affordable housing tools, support for the Housing Trust Fund, and we get into some of the more specific direction around housing within that policy document. I'll pause. Are there any questions on the Panther Lake Community Park or the statement in support of housing?
Councilmember Larmer, do you have a question?
Yeah, so Briahna, you said we're not going to go into detail on the policy document, but I did just have one question on there. In the manufactured housing, if we could maybe, I'd like to propose that we add a line about preservation as well in the mobile home paragraph.
So if I'm looking at the mobile home park legislation statement, it says the City of Kent supports proposals that enhance, and you're saying that preserve and enhance mobile home park?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. That seems consistent with other elements of the document if council is amenable. Okay.
I think that sounds fine. If it's, like you said, if it's consistent with the message we're trying to say, that makes sense.
Yeah, we can easily make that adjustment to the policy document if that's okay.
Thank you. Councilmember Larmer, did that answer your question?
It did, thank you.
All right, thank you. And I am not seeing any other hands raised.
Okay, so we'll move on to our funding request to support downtown businesses. The first one is a capital funding request for $1 million for Gateway to Downtown that will make downtown a destination and enhance green space for nearby residents as well as businesses. The idea here is by investing in infrastructure to create an entryway into downtown that we can support our local businesses and attract people into the downtown. The next request is a transportation request for $5 million to complete the Meet Me on Meeker project, which will connect businesses to light rail, commuter rail, and transit hubs using bicycle and pedestrian improvements. Again, both of these requests are requests that we put forward last legislative session and started to get our legislators engaged and supportive of these requests. I'll just keep moving on unless you all interrupt me. We're putting forward 2 different transportation requests to support the manufacturing center. The first is a $2 million request for the interurban trail, which makes intersection improvements to it, provide a multimodal commuting option into the manufacturing center to help attract a quality workforce and improve safety. And the second request is a $20 million request to complete 224th. We've received funding from the legislature in previous years for the 224th corridor. This would be the last chunk of money to complete that corridor. You'll recall that this corridor, also referred to as Veterans Road, goes from 509 to 167 and then up into Kent's East Hill. So this is that last remaining 2-lane stretch that would be improved to be a 3-lane arterial, including curbs, gutters, and sidewalks. And again, we've put forward that 224th funding request in previous years, and that would be very much dependent, as would be the interurban trail and the Meet Me on Meeker projects, dependent on the development of a transportation revenue package. So that rounds out the top legislative priorities. So just to recap, we'd be focused on proposals around social justice reform, streamlined sales tax mitigation, and then capital and transportation projects. If there are no further thoughts there, I'll briefly bring up the policy document to see if there are any questions on that item.
Councilmember Boyce, you have your hand raised.
Yes, one other question for you, Briahna. So I know you you and your organization represent quite a few other cities. I'm just curious about are we in line with some of the other things that they're requesting from a prioritization perspective?
Yeah, I think so. Obviously, streamlined sales tax mitigation is unique to the city of Kent in being a very high and top priority. But otherwise, most communities are putting their local funding requests as top priorities. And then several are adding social justice reform or police reform onto their top priority list. I would say that some communities have taken some of the items that you have on your policy document and chosen to elevate them to top priority issues for local reasons. But given that our focus really needs to be on streamlined sales tax mitigation, you know, to elevate something to the front page, it seemed like the social justice reform was the item that would elevate to that level rather than some of these other items in the policy document.
I strongly agree. Thank you.
Great question, Councilmember Boyce. Councilmember Thomas, you have your hand raised.
I do, and I think I'm, oh, good. Briahna, excuse me. I served in the legislature several years ago, and I can wait on this question if you want to the end, or can I do it now?
No, it's fine.
Okay, this is more of a practical thing. So was the spring or the short session, was it virtual?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, the legislature convened their work just as the pandemic was beginning to ramp up.
That's what I thought.
Everything occurred in person in March, and then they concluded in mid-March.
I find the practicality of this going virtual is going to be really, really awkward. And I can see why you say there's going to be fewer bills. Just getting signatures on your bill from maybe the chair or the vice chair or any others to support your particular bill, and then taking it, putting it in the hopper, for example. I'm just wondering how this is going to work out. I'm very curious.
Yeah, so my understanding is that they have figured out a way to do the entire bill introduction process virtually. So legislators will be able to sign on to a bill as a co-sponsor,
Okay.
a virtual
Okay.
mechanism. They'll be able to submit it to the hopper via a virtual mechanism. They have not shared the specifics of what that would look like with the public
All right.
and with lobbyists. So it is all uncertain, but I'm told that there is virtual workarounds to nearly all of that, and that the current hang up is on how they would actually handle voting on the floor. So that's the one thing that perhaps there's not a clearly identified solution to at this time.
So there's no way to tie in your desk to the voting machines up. I know the Senate's done by oral, but in the House we did it by machine. So there's no way to connect that to from your home to the machine up there, the voting machine?
Yeah, I think they're working on that. The other thing that they are being cognizant of is, you know, if the Senate does vote orally, then the Senate is there in person, but the House is not. And that doesn't seem prudent. And so how can the Senate accommodate a virtual voting format so that both chambers can have the same format? They don't want one chamber to be advantaged or disadvantaged over the other.
Correct. Well, I'm going to be interested to watch this. Thank you.
Yes, of course. I'm also very interested to see how this progresses. So.
Thank you. Councilmember Corey, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Briahna, I have a question about the multifamily tax exemption.
Mm-hmm.
It says the city asks if the legislature reforms the exemption that affordability and other requirements not be added unless it can be demonstrated it will not stall the construction of multifamily units in the local markets. What does that mean, and what other requirements are being considered at the state level? Like, kind of aware of anything?
Sure. So we saw a bill introduced we saw two bills introduced last legislative session that would have made changes to the multifamily property tax exemption. And then Senator Dawes, Representative Rommel, and Representative Wallen have initiated a stakeholder process to put together a proposal for this upcoming session. Because they're still in their stakeholder process, I don't know specifically what proposal will be brought forward this session, but some of the things that we saw in the bills last year was adding additional affordability requirements, adding requirements on the square footage of units, adding requirements on the number of bedrooms in a unit, changing the reporting requirements, so changing how once the exemption is utilized, how we track and monitor and report on that data, changing how once the exemption ends, how tenants are notified that the end of the 8-year or 12-year time period is reaching an end, and what resources are provided to those tenants, whether there are any prevailing wage requirements or apprenticeship requirements as those projects are being completed. In short, it's a wide array of different requirements that have been discussed and thrown out on the table. And as I mentioned, I'm not sure which of those requirements will be included in any sort of proposal that is finally introduced into the 2021 legislative session. So this language is really saying, as we look at those requirements, that we want to make sure that the tool, that the end result, the end exemption tool that's provided would still allow, would still be fit for the Kent housing market, so that it would still work for the city of Kent. One of the dynamics that we started to see was that some of these additional requirements were coming forward, and examples were being used of how, oh, this requirement is on a development in downtown Seattle and it works just fine there. Well, that's good, all well and good, except for something that works in downtown Seattle may not work in the city of Kent. So this is just language sort of getting at the desire to make sure that whatever requirements are brought forward work for the city of Kent.
Thank you.
Councilmember Larmer.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering out loud here, because this sounds like there's a greater array of possible changes than I had even imagined. is it my understanding that this document allows you to weigh in on these without further consulting with us? I'm just wondering if this just seems like such a hot topic and it's such a varied, I think I would want us to be consulted perhaps if there's that much variety in what changes they might be proposing.
Sure. So typically the way we handle bills that get introduced along these lines is I submit them to departments to get department feedback and then get direction from the city administrator and the mayor's office on, given that department's feedback, how best to weigh in. Perhaps I'll defer to the city administrator, Derek, to weigh in on how we might bring something like this to council as we see it more refined, because I don't think that typically we do. I usually highlight how we weigh in my weekly legislative reports. And so you'd have awareness of it from that standpoint.
I think that's what I'm looking for more than anything, because it sounds like there will be a lot of variety in what's being proposed. So it's just really awareness. I don't want to be, caught.
Yeah, so at each week during the legislative session, I provide a written report and it highlights what bills we supported, opposed, provided feedback on. And I can make a particular note on this issue to provide even greater detail on the specific stakeholder discussions or whatnot, if that's council's desire.
It would definitely be useful for me.
Okay.
Thank you, Briahna. So Councilmember Larmer, that helps then with that.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's a great solution.
Okay.
Thank you.
Me too. Are there any other discussion items on the policy document?
I'm just looking to see if any hands are raised. Councilmember Fincher.
Thank you. I was kicked off. I didn't hear what Councilmember Larmer had asked. So I heard the answer, but what was her question?
So Brenda, my question was just how do we get increased awareness, since it sounds like there'll be a broader array of changes to multifamily tax exemption being considered than I had expected. Especially for my work on Affordable Housing Committee, just being aware of everything that's being discussed weekly would be really helpful.
Okay. And so they'll be passing that on to all of us?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Councilmember Fincher, as you remember, Briahna gives us those weekly updates on what's happening, and she will make sure that the information in there is very clear and passing that on to all of us. So.
Yes, I appreciate those. They're very detailed. Good job, Briahna.
My pleasure. I'm glad you guys read them. It makes me feel better about spending my weekend writing it.
All right, I'm not seeing any other hands raised. Any other questions on this portion here?
Okay. So that concludes my discussion with you all this evening. I think the next steps is for you all to approve a final version of the documents that you saw before you. I will be working with the city's graphics expertise to get these documents into more of a final form that will be presentable to our legislators.
Madam President, I just wanted to confirm, was there consensus on the one change that Councilmember Larmer proposed on mobile home parks to add preserve and enhance before we put it on the consent calendar next week?
Did anyone have any objection to that?
I do.
Okay. Do you want to speak on it, or?
No, I just would like to hear what other people say. I'm not into the preserving part of it. So I'll talk about it when it comes up.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, and I think I asked the question to Briahna. It is in line with the other language that we're using. And of course, I rely on you, Briahna, to give us guidance in how we word these documents. So
Yeah, just generally, all of our advocacy on housing is around preservation of housing and increasing housing supply and providing more affordability. So the idea that we would add the word preserve to preserve the existing mobile home park options seems consistent with our other advocacy statements.
This is Bill, and I think it makes sense. I mean, it falls in line, right? I mean, I think preservation is important, right? So it's just, I can live with that.
Okay. And I think I saw Councilmember Fincher had given a thumbs up. I'm not seeing huge consensus on leaving that piece out. So if everyone is okay, I think that's really the only major change that we have in moving this document forward. Is that correct with everyone? Is everyone, I'm just trying to, at this point, get an idea, is there any objection to moving this legislative agenda forward to the consent calendar?
I'm good.
Okay.
I have no strong objection.
All right, I'm not seeing any hands raised. So we will move this forward to the consent agenda. I'm sorry, the consent calendar. Thank you, Briahna, so much for always keeping us informed. You do a great job, and even with your hands full at this point. So we really, really appreciate it. And we look forward to hearing your weekly reviews once everything gets back in session, and crossing our fingers. So thank you so much.
My pleasure, and always feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions on legislative issues or otherwise. I make myself available.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, we are going to move on in our agenda, and I am going to welcome April. We have an information only item, the Transportation Master Plan Public Outreach Update. Welcome, April.
Hello, thank you for having me tonight. So Josh Mosberg from Communications is also going to be joining me for this presentation for some of the slides. Next slide, please. Tonight's presentation focuses on the latest public outreach campaign for the Transportation Master Plan, or TMP. Next slide, please. The outreach efforts officially launched the week of August 17th. Originally, the outreach was scheduled to close on September 14th. The close date was extended to September 23rd to facilitate a social media and partnership push to reach more residents, especially equity populations and businesses. Outreach was staged to maximize exposure and reach to residents, especially those underserved residents. Next slide, please. Equity was at the forefront of the outreach campaign. Due to COVID, staff sought to engage with underserved populations via multiple strategies. An updated fact sheet was distributed online and via social media, and the fact sheet was translated into Somali, Vietnamese, Ukraine, and Spanish. Next slide, please. Outreach efforts can be categorized by their function. There were three primary purposes of the outreach effort. The Getting the Word Out stage focused on publicizing the outreach effort, especially the need for public feedback. The Sharing Information stage focused on getting information on the top 37 quarters and 120 projects to the residents and businesses in Kent. And last, the Seeking Feedback stage focused on opportunities for residents and businesses to provide feedback. Next slide. The outreach campaign utilized four primary methods to get the word out: posters, partnerships, social media, and eConnect. Next slide, please. Staff visited 19 ethnic grocery stores and 8 grocery and retail stores to request permission and to post a TMP poster. In addition, staff hung posters at 13 parks and trails. One note, at Ravi Video and Indo-Fiji Grocery, the owner requested I thank the Kent's Economic and Community Development staff for loan assistance to offset COVID. Next slide, please. Staff utilized partnerships with Kent boards and committees, neighborhood councils, City of Kent CTR, which is Commute Trip Reduction Effective Businesses, the Transportation Advisory Board, and advocacy and fellowship organizations. Staff sent emails, we called, we hosted workshops, gave presentations, and solicited interviews to get the word out to the community. Equity organizations and places of fellowship contacted included the Islamic Center of Kent, Open Doors for Multicultural Families, Coalition of Refugees from Burma, Kent Hope, Refugees Northwest Lutheran Community Services, Mother Africa, and CMAR Health Centers. Staff plan to continue to reach out to equity-focused organizations as well as these places of worship. Next slide, please. And I'm going to turn it over to Josh.
Good evening, Madam Mayor, Madam President, council members. I know April has a lot to cover, so I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. We used a combination of geographic and demographic targeting strategies for our social media outreach for the TMP. As you can see, we were able to reach a broadly inclusive population of Kent residents with our targeted social media ads on Facebook and Instagram. Just with spending $500, we were able to reach tens of thousands of residents who saw our advertisements multiple times. And so we feel very good about that. Next slide, please. So with our targeting strategy, we, as April mentioned, want to be broadly inclusive with who are we reaching and who was actually able to provide input on the TMP by viewing these advertisements. The kind of click-through here for a lot of these advertisements was the web map and the survey on the TMP website. So we created creative content artwork to target multiple non-English speaking residents, as well as English speaking residents with varying age groups and all living within the city of Kent. So you can see our potential and actual reaches with those digital and social media advertisements. Next slide, please. This is just kind of another slide that details the difference between residents who saw our advertisements on mobile versus desktop. I think this is important to note for future advertising efforts. Most of our residents are absolutely viewing our content on mobile. And so, for future outreach, I think that's very important to note and wanted to pass that along. Next slide, please. This slide is just a kind of preview of just some of the creative content that we used for our targeted advertising. On the left there is just what it would look like if you're scrolling by on your mobile device with a call to action and click through various images and different language to reach different populations. Next slide, please. This slide is a view at our translations. As you saw earlier, we were able to run advertisements in English, Spanish, Vietnamese, and Ukrainian, and we're able to reach quite a few residents that might not otherwise would have seen some of these materials. So we feel pretty good about that. Next slide, please. We did try a bit of what we would call some brand humanization by running social media advertisements that were directed at younger demographics. And what we found were that those advertisements performed significantly better than some of our other more professional advertisements. I think that is something just important to note for future outreach and strategies for getting residents to actually solicit and give us their input. Next slide, please. In addition to all the digital and social media advertising campaign we did on Facebook and Instagram, we also sent out emails to our transportation eConnect bulletin lists. As you can see, those were some of the numbers that we got on recipients as well as the rates. And so, overall, considering the amount of residents that actually saw the advertisements, considering our population here, I feel that this was absolutely worth the money and should continue to be used in future outreach efforts for public works projects. Thank you.
Next slide, please. Thank you, Josh. Next, Kent staff focused on sharing information with residents and businesses. The TMP website was the primary method of sharing information, supplemented by emailing as well as mailing materials. Next slide, please. The website housed the 5 fact sheets in 5 languages, a brochure with each of the 5 sub-areas, maps, and 37 project corridors detailed, and as well as a detailed list of the 120 projects by sub-area. Next slide, please. Over the 1-month outreach effort, the website had 2,556 visits, with 2,424 being unique visitors. An interesting part of this is that we saw spikes that correlate with social media efforts, particularly the ads. Next slide, please. A review of the traffic sources, how the website was accessed, indicated that increased traffic from the social media after social media ads, but also an interesting was the direct sources, and that's where you would actually type in the URL of www.kenttmp.com. Were very steady over the entire course of the outreach effort. Next slide. The last stage was seeking feedback from residents, employees, and businesses. Next slide. We used both quantitative as well as qualitative strategies. The online survey and the web map are both quantitative strategies that each received extensive input. These separate strategies tell staff which corridors and projects are the most important for Kent residents and employees. The qualitative measures included presentations, workshops, interviews, and emails. These qualitative measures provide context for why projects are important, as well as the very specific projects on each of the corridor that are important. Next slide. The online survey utilized SurveyMonkey. The survey itself was embedded in the TMP website. The survey received 643 responses from residents from West Hill, Downtown, and North and Southeast Hill. One question asked residents to tell staff what we missed. The responses included feedback on a top 120 project, as well as feedback on new projects. And interestingly, we received quite a bit of input on transportation policies and the work of other departments, as well as needs related to Metro Transit. Staff are still compiling the feedback to inform the draft project list and to share with other departments, as well as Metro Transit. I'm going to go over the top projects from the survey for each sub-area. One note, each of the details of the specific projects were included in the packet that you received. The top 3 corridors in the downtown sub-area were DSA 3, which is James Street from James Street Park and Ride to Jason Avenue, DSA 11, which is rail grade separation at Willis and BNSF and Willis at Union Pacific Railroad, and DSA 10, which is a planning study on Central Avenue. Next slide. The top 3 corridors in the Manufacturing and Industrial Center, or MIC sub-area, was MIC 6, which is railroad grade separations at South 212th Street and BNSF and at South 212th Street and Union Pacific Railroad, MIC 2, which is South 212th Street from Aurelia Road to State Route 167, and MIC 4, which is South 228th Street, 83rd Avenue from Military to 88th Avenue South. Next slide. The top 3 corridors in Midway sub-area were Midway 4, which is Military Road, Midway 1, which is 3 intersections on South 272nd Street, and Midway 2, which is Reeth Road, South 259th and South 260th. Next slide, please. The top 3 corridors in the Northeast Hill sub-area are Northeast Hill 5, which is 132nd Avenue Southeast, Northeast Hill 2, which is South 240th Street, and Northeast Hill 4, which is Southeast 116th Avenue. And next slide. The top 3 corridors in the Southeast Hill with Southeast Hill 8, which is Southeast Kangley Road at 124th Avenue, Southeast Hill 1, which is 132nd Avenue Southeast, and Southeast Hill 3, which is Southeast 256th Street. Next slide, please. Thank you. The web map is the second quantitative strategy staff used. The web map received 622 votes and 40 comments on specific corridors. Unlike the survey, the web map had features to provide specific comments on each of the top 37 corridors. I'm going to go over kind of some of the background more on these ones. The top projects were DSA 11, DSA 10, and there was a tie at third for between DSA 2 and DSA 6. These results are highly similar to the online survey. One note, I wasn't surprised to see a flip between DSA 3 and DSA 2, which is James Street, 2 different segments of it. A couple of the interviews included extensive discussion on James Street and which segment of James Street was the most important, and a really important factor that kind of harks back to the goals that were adopted by council. The major discussion was connectivity and which connectivity to what things were more important, whether that was a Green River Trail or getting to Kent Station. Next slide, please. The top 3 corridors for the Manufacturing Industrial Center for the web map were again MIC 2, MIC 4, and MIC 6. So these three are also the same ones that we saw in the survey, and these ones are also in the same order. The correlation between the two sources really kind of harkens on how high of a priority each of these projects are. Next slide, please. The top 3 quarters in the Midway sub-area are Midway 4, followed by a tie at second between Midway 1 and Midway 2. As with the manufacturing industrial, this also very highly mirrors the survey results. And kind of to give some context, there was 2 presentations to neighborhood councils on the West Hill. And this very much reflects what we heard from them, especially the heavy importance on making sure Military Road was a roadway that could really complement the new Federal Lake extension that's coming in. Next slide, please. The top 3 quarters in the Northeast Hill sub-area were Northeast Hill 2, so South 240th Street, Northeast Hill 5, which is 132nd Avenue Southeast, and Northeast Hill 4, which is 116th. For this one, the web map results reflect similar results as the survey, but there is a flip between the first and the second highest priority. One interesting thing is the interviews really gave a lot of context on understanding which roadway and corridor is a higher priority. Many of the interviews went extensively into understanding that there is going to be a limited budget and we can't build everything. And most of the discussion for 132nd really centered on if you could only build one between 116th and 132nd, which of one of those corridors really is the higher priority. Next slide, please. The top 3 quarters in the Southeast Hill are Southeast Hill 3, which is Southeast 256th Street, Southeast Hill 1, which is 132nd, and then Southeast Hill 2, which is Southeast 248th Street. And the survey and the web map had 2 of the top 10 corridors. Out of all of the sub areas, this is the one that kind of has the most differences between the survey and the web map. One interesting item on this one is in interviews again, we did go over the significance of 106th and 132nd in this sub area, and it really did mirror the discussion for the Northeast Hill. In addition, for Southeast 256, a lot of the comments that were specific to this, being able to get comments on the web map, were really hearkened to the need for pedestrian facilities and a safe routes to school for the school that is located in this area, as well as walking ability to the Seuss Creek. And then lastly, Southeast 248th Street. A lot of the comments pointed to the segments of Southeast 248th Street that are east and west of 104th, and the need for pedestrians to be able to access 104th and the transit, as well as to be able to cross 104th. Next slide. Staff conducted 9 one-on-one interviews with members of the Cultural Community Board and the Transportation Advisory Board. In addition, staff presented to the Cultural Communities Board, the Land Use Planning Board, and 2 neighborhood councils on the West Hill. In addition, we facilitated a workshop with the Kent Bicycle Advisory Board. Notably, staff received extensive feedback on critical projects from Metro Transit, as well as the Kent School District. Next slide. There are still a couple of tasks that complete that are related to developing the draft project list. Next slide. Staff continue to review public feedback, refine cost estimates, and the capital budget. Public feedback is being used to inform the draft project funded list. Staff from police, economic and community development, parks, and public works are collaborating to develop that draft funded list. I anticipate bringing that draft list to the committee of the whole on November 10th. And I will gladly take any questions. That was a lot of information.
Great information, though. Really interesting to see how the community responded to this. Councilmember Boyce.
Great presentation, and I agree with Council President. Just the community feedback seemed really, you guys really done an extra effort job to reach out. So what is the timeline? Where are we at? So you're going to bring it back to us, and then just talk to me through all the next step where we're going to be going for here, please.
I can gladly. So one of the things we're doing now is I am coordinating with the different departments and staff from those departments to start looking at the project list. As we talked about in a previous workshop, we don't have enough money to fund all of it. We really only have enough money to fund about 20 to 25% of all the projects that were made it to that list. So what staff is doing is looking at the public feedback, looking at what's going on with our own department to understand what projects absolutely must be funded, and which projects could potentially be on the visionary list. That, as you can imagine, is a little bit of a difficult kind of practical effort, and it involves a couple of pieces that take a little bit of time, including looking at cost estimates for different projects. We're looking at maybe only building portions of it and creating new cost estimates. In addition, we're going to all have to sit down together in order to really have an understanding and making sure that we didn't miss something, and that once we put all the projects that our draft project list on a map, that we don't see a critical gap that we didn't see because we were just too far into it. From there, we'll be bringing to you, the council, on November 10th. That draft project list will be constrained. Right now, the number we are shooting for is less than $250 million worth of projects. That fits within the budget that we discussed at a previous meeting. And it also fits within our expectations for how much we might be able to fund from local improvement districts. From there, I'll be working with each council member and answering any questions to give feedback on how we got to that project list. If we miss something that you're hearing from your constituents, it is very important for us to put in. That should take us through the end of November. I will likely be coming back in December to give an update on where we are in all this processes. Another piece that's also happening in the background is we're working on policies that drive some of these funding decisions, so that we can also show that to you. And from there, we are looking at having a draft document in the middle of December, and be working through the process to share with the council and with public all of the different chapters and different elements, and working towards adopting that.
Thanks, April. Councilmember Fincher.
Thank you. Again, I just want to thank April for all the community outreach. I know that, we saw a list of names on the screen, but I know that she contacted more than that, and sometimes multiple times trying to, and waiting for people to get back to her. So it was just a marvelous effort. Thank you very much, April. I really appreciate it, and it benefits our community.
Thank you so much.
Well said, Councilmember Fincher. Councilmember Kaur.
Thank you, April. Guys, you've done a great job with outreach on this transportation master plan. I think this is the best we have done so far on outreach with different diverse communities. My only question is, did we reach out to any individuals who do not use phone or email or don't have access to internet? Did we do any, I don't know what kind of outreach we did with them. I know you were at the grocery store, so did you talk to people in person? I mean, it's kind of hard in COVID times, but just trying to figure out what sort of outreach we might have done there.
So one of the unique things that we set out relatively early on is something we are calling partnerships. With COVID, we had to be imaginative on how we reach others. And so we put the net as wide as possible and sending out emails to like the neighborhood councils and working with them to get information to their different residents in their area. Some of it was sending them print materials to make sure that they could share it with those who weren't able to access the internet. So that was one way that we did that.
Thank you. Great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, April, wonderful job. I just have a quick question. So you have some of this data. Is it aligning with what you were kind of expecting? I know you said that there were some surprises, some things that didn't surprise you. Anything really big that stuck out so far through this process?
I don't think there's really anything. I think the biggest thing is understanding the importance of moving towards that multimodal system and making sure that when we're planning for a transportation system, that it really is a system for all modes and all people. And that really did come through in many of the comments when talking about a roadway and the importance of, yes, I'm in congestion, but also a lot of them also acknowledge that I can't cross the street and I need you to help with that, and including pedestrian facilities. So we really have kind of moved the needle quite a bit in that direction.
Wonderful. Great job. Any other questions for April before we move on in our agenda? All right. Wonderful job, April. Keep it up, and we will see you back here next month. Thank you.
I think Councilman Kaur got her hands up, but like.
Councilmember Kaur.
I just forgot to lower it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Boyce. All right, moving on in the agenda, consultant service agreement with GeoEngineers for the Lower Russell Levee accreditation study. I'd like to welcome Toby to present for us.
Thank you, Council President. Thank you for having me. Again, my name is Toby Hallock. I'm an Environmental Engineer 3 in Public Works. I'm here to discuss a project update and a consultant services agreement with GeoEngineers for FEMA levee accreditation for the Lower Russell Setback Levee. This is a project that we've partnered with the King County Flood Control District on. It is the largest project that we've partnered with the district on so far, with a project sum of about $52 million. You can see a large portion of this levee segment in this, and while this picture, you can see the whole levee segment. If you go back one slide, please. You can see a large segment that shows the newly constructed flood wall. And you can see the flood wall is the kind of a white line between the existing levee, which is Russell Road, and the existing buildings out there. This drone photo was taken earlier this year after this flood wall had been completed. In the smaller photos to the right and or to the upper right and to the bottom, you can see the upper right shows the new earthen levee, and then the bottom photo shows a ground shot of the new flood wall. For the next slide, you can get an overview of the entire project. It spans from South 228th Street to South 212th Street. The flood wall, as I mentioned before, has been completed. It spans from almost 228th Street all the way up to the PSE Corridor Trail. And then from there, an earthen levee will tie into that and go all the way up to South 228th Street. The new flood protection system will be built to the 500-year flood elevation plus 3 feet of freeboard. This is more than enough to meet FEMA's levee accreditation requirements. Other improvements for this project include a backwater habitat channel, a scour protection with large wood structures for fish habitat, and a relocated Van Doren's Landing Park. The next couple slides show how progress has been made on this project. With this project, it started last year with the flood wall construction, and that was completed this year. This year, the focus has been on the earthwork, and in this slide, you can see the new setback levee, and you can see the great distance that it is from the river. They pretty much just eliminated any of the vegetation that was on the ground to get ready to build the foundation for this new setback levee. On the next slide, you can see the excuse me, you can see the levee is actually starting to get built in small sections, and you can also see excavation in what was Van Doren's Landing Park. They also started excavating in some of the other areas that will become habitat areas as well. And this photo is from August. And these photos are all north is to the right. And this last photo is from earlier this month. And this actually has some of the labels from the plan, so it's a little easier to see what's going on. You can see more excavation in what was Van Doren's Landing Park directly to the east. So just below that is where the new park will be, and they've been filling that park in, so the new park will also be above the flood level. And at this point, they had already completed the new secondary levee for what work they're going to do this year. And they've completed temporary tie-ins to the existing levee to make sure that we have flood protection through this wet season. On this last slide, I show, last slide from the aerials, I suppose, shows the distance between the old levee, which was Russell Road, and the new levee. You can see, it's quite a big difference. In places it's 300 feet or more. It's great opportunity for the city to provide flood protection habitat improvement and provide recreational amenities. I guess I did have one other aerial slide. I forgot about that on the next one. Actually, one more, please, Kim. On this slide, you can see where the flood wall has been completed. During the next phase of the work, they're going to expand the earthen levee from just south of the warehouse. It's a little further to the north and out of this picture, but they'll expand it and tie it into this levee. The PSE corridor trail will have to be raised to go up and over the flood protection system. So the trail will still be usable for pedestrians and cyclists. The reason for the project, as you can see on this next slide, is there has been some significant slumping and erosion. These pictures were taken at the Holiday Kennel slump, is what we've called it. This was right out in front where the Holiday Kennel dog facility used to be located. This was after the February storm event, where the river was up almost to the top of the trail, and as you can see in these pictures, the erosion was also almost up to the top of the trail. We've worked with our Parks Department to make sure we close this portion of the trail due to pedestrian and cyclist safety. And just to be clear, the new setback levee and temporary tie-ins have been constructed, so this area isn't as large of a concern for us for this wet season. We do have protection setback from the river, so we will be safe. In the next slide, we show some of the improvements for the park. The new park will have all of the same amenities as the old park, like restrooms, picnic shelters, benches, barbecues, and it'll also have additional features. A Mount Rainier play structure will be built, and that's surely to be a big draw. There'll also be a pickleball court and a wiffle ball field. Other recreational features on this project include an improved Green River Trail throughout the stretch between South 228th Street and South 212th Street. And on the last slide, you can see just kind of the overall project again. So the last slide, Kim, the King County Flood District hired a consultant to design this project, and as I mentioned before, their project will exceed FEMA's accreditation standards. However, their consultant was not hired to get FEMA accreditation, and so the city is working on that. So we're working to get this contract with GeoEngineers in place, and that will have them analyze the new flood protection system, prepare all the needed documentation to certify that this levee will be built to these standards, and then they can submit a accreditation report to FEMA. Once the accreditation report has been approved by FEMA, it will allow areas that are protected behind this levee to be removed from the FEMA floodplain maps. That will help reduce development restrictions. It will remove the requirement for homeowners to get flood insurance if they have a federally backed mortgage. And so it's a great benefit to this area. And this levee will connect to the Upper Russell levee, which is to the south, and the Boeing levee to the north. And those two projects have already gone through FEMA, and we're working to get those two projects accredited. And as you know, we've done a number of these projects and working to get them all accredited. And it's a large overall project, but with all of these levee segments combined, they will remove about 2/3 of the Kent Valley from those floodplain maps. So thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, Toby. Really much needed project, but I'm super excited for the park. I think it's going to have something for everyone, and it just looks really cool. Very excited about that. Anybody have any questions on this for Toby? Councilmember Michaud.
Thank you, Council President. Toby, was this accreditation study an expected cost? Because I know that the King County Flood District is paying for this project.
It was an expected cost. The flood district has not done any of these or paid for any of these accreditation studies or reports in the past, and they have told us that that's not what they intend to do. They are building it to those standards, but they're not going through the process of getting it accredited. They're leaving that to the local jurisdictions.
All right, any other questions for Toby? All right, so I'm not seeing any hands raised. Everyone has the motion in their packet. This is to authorize the mayor to sign a consultant agreement with GeoEngineers. Any objection to moving it forward? All right, Toby, it looks like you are good to go. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
All right, moving on in our agenda, we are going to hear from Bill Ellis on the Naden Assemblage update. Information only. Welcome, Bill.
Hi, welcome. Good evening. Looking at the wrong PowerPoint at the moment there, Kim, yep, shortly. So I last spoke to council last week on the economic development update. I had shared with council regarding the Naden Avenue assemblage, the southernmost 2 acres that we had a purchase and sale agreement unclosed, unsigned with Braintree Hospitality. There were a variety of milestones in that, and we were confronting one very soon on October 12th. Next slide, please. So the Hilton Garden Inn project, I would say, is now officially behind us. We've terminated the purchase and sale agreement. A milestone was not met. While Braintree Development Group had received an offer of franchise from Hilton Corporate at the Naden location for a Hilton Garden Inn, Braintree never executed on that agreement and produced that signed agreement. Instead, Friday of last week, they sent a letter saying that they could not meet that given the changes in the marketplace. As we've been discussing all year, council, we have been facing a worst ever market for hospitality. So some steps have taken place. Escrow has been directed to refund the $100,000 to Braintree Hospitality, and that will officially be the end. Their letter to us cited the cost to construct amid ever weakening market forecasts. And I'll just mention, it was the front page of the Business Journal yesterday that the American Hotel and Lodging Association predicts, without more federal relief in this state, in Washington state, more than 530 hotels out of the 1,100 hotels in Washington state face foreclosure. Next slide, please. The hotel industry is in historic trouble. We've lost close to 15,000 jobs in the Tri-County metro area of the Seattle area. Revenue, if you can make out that chart in the lower right-hand corner, revenue per room has shrunk in the metro area more than 60%, which is in keeping with what we're seeing in our lodging tax receipts. Downtown Seattle, it's worse, but in King County, it's down quite a bit. And room occupancy rate is down around 15%. There was a lot of optimism back in March and April that perhaps we'll see a V-shaped recovery. We'd go into lockdown for a few weeks. We'd get over this, and people would go back to the hotels. People would fly again. Cruise ship terminals would reopen. None of that's come to pass. Hospitality industry, despite the earlier rosier predictions of bouncing back in a year, now it's looking 3 to 5 years out, potentially, dependent on vaccine and other things before the industry feels that they will recover from where they were. So I think given this climate was weighing heavily on the project, some key findings of recent surveys by industry associations, more than 2/3 of hotels report they'll be able to only last 6 more months at current projected revenue and occupancy levels without federal relief. 74 are saying that they will be forced into further layoffs. So it's a real dangerous time for hotels. And although there was a lot of bullishness about our location in the middle of the industrial valley and some of the employment growth that we have seen specifically in the industrial sector, we are, of course, in a regional economy, and the compression, what was called as compression room stay in downtown Seattle, having completely evaporated, there wasn't a lot of confidence moving forward that they could justify the high continuing cost of construction with the forecasts for revenue. So next slide. That's all I have to share today. Any questions?
Thank you, Bill. Disappointing, but I think somewhat expected at this point. Any questions for Bill? Councilmember Michaud, you have your hand up, but I think it's from the last question. All right, Councilmember Larmer.
Thank you, Council President. Yeah, just echoing what Tony said. Very disappointing, not unexpected though. Bill, where does this leave us? I mean, what possibilities might we still have?
Well, as you know, Councilmember Larmer is a panelist for the North Naden Assemblage. We have scheduled 2 other development teams the next week or two. I think they were still getting scheduled the second group here in a few days. But for the manufacturing campus is something that is in the was advertised in the 5.5 acre range. To go from 5.5 acres for a business park concept to 7 acres is not a big leap at this early stage, and something I would urge panelists to think about in their questions when they're talking to those development teams, and I'm sure they'll have opinions and comments. Again, I think not surprising for anyone at this point, not surprising to other developers, but I think where it leaves us is actually new opportunities, new choices going forward. As far as the location and all the work that's been done by city staff to date, all this in preparation for the site, I think still helps set up any future development. So all our discussions about the right in, right out, discussions with PSC, were all still necessary steps. And I think what we are going to probably look at as a choice right now is sliding from one development team with what we're serving up to a different development team with an adjusted concept to what are the new market opportunities, given that hotel industry does not seem an immediate or even midterm opportunity at this stage.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions for Bill? All right, thank you so much for that information. Joining us tonight, thank you. All right, moving on, I'm going to welcome Kaelene to talk about, we have an ordinance of adopting the process updates to the Kent City Code.
All right, can you hear me? All right, hi everyone. Good afternoon, members of City Council. My name is Kaelene Nobis, and I'm a long-range planner in ECD. I'm here today to present to you on Chapter 12 and 15 process amendments. Next slide, please. As you're aware, the City of Kent has been embarking on updating our permitting processes in the last couple of years. We've been actively working to get digital permit software to be rolled out by next year. And as a member of this team, I was also tasked to look at other efficiency measures within how we regulate our land use permit processes. We went to LUPB in July with some ideas, gathered their feedback, and came back again for a hearing in September, incorporating all of staff's findings and LUPB's ideas on draft amendments. So we're here tonight to talk about those proposed changes. Next slide. When reviewing other cities' codes in the surrounding jurisdictions, we found that our code has 4 areas for improvement: conditional use permits or hearings, committees for land use approval, public notice procedures, and internal consistency measures. Next slide. The biggest area for staff efficiency was how many permits we have that need hearings. This increases staff time and applicant cost. Historically, cities have used conditional use permits and public hearings as a procedural barrier for undesirable uses where impacts couldn't really be adequately mitigated. But in the past 10 to 20 years, the city code has become more robust. We have developed standards that are stronger, and we have stricter criteria for approval. And we realize that the real reason for hearings is to obtain public comment, but we can continue to obtain public comment and not go to a hearing. So in order to facilitate this, staff is proposing to create a new process called a minor CUP. This would allow for us to review the proposal against our code, require the same amount of public notice. It would also have public comment, but the review would be entirely internal, saving a lot of time and cost to the applicant. Staff's proposing to move about 2/3 of the items that currently require a full CUP into that category, leaving full CUPs for land exhaustive uses or very loud and noisy uses where impacts are a little more unforeseen and they benefit from having a full hearing. In addition to CUPs, the proposal would make all wireless permits and special home occupation permits administrative, and those reviews would be very similar to a minor CUP. Next slide. Another change would be to the committee structure. Land use processes have changed a lot since the code was originally written. We're currently one of the only cities in the area that I could tell that still has a short plat and or binding site plan committee instead of just a fully administrative process for short plats and binding site plans. There's nothing inherently wrong with this. It's just not really as efficient because the committees who are making the decisions are staff who've already reviewed the entire permit process. There's already been normally multiple meetings, a pre-application meeting and a development review internal committee meeting prior to the approval of that permit. And it's just an extra documentation step to review the comments that we've already addressed and conditions that staff have already wanted to place on the permit. So we're proposing to eliminate the committee structure in favor for an administrative director decision. The decisions would still be appealable. They still would have the same criteria for review, and the decision body would just end up being the planning director or the ECD director. Next slide, please. One of the other categories for improvement is a public notice procedure. With some simple changes to our code, we believe that we could increase citizen engagement and have a better public notice process for applicants and citizens across the board. This would be moving to have applicant pre-printed and installed signs. Currently, applicants buy a large board from the city, pick it up at shops, install it on the ground with posts and bolts that they need to purchase separately, and then they call or email city staff to schedule us to post on the board, which we place a laminated paper on the board. So having essentially a document that we would provide the applicant with a pamphlet and the specs for that they could get printed at any sign company of what our sign needed to look like would save a lot of effort. And it'd be able to be replicated by any sign company. I've called quite a few. It actually might be cheaper in the end for them as well. It would be clearly printed, including the website, the project name, and it would directly link to our new Build Kent website, which is already live, which would kind of bring our public notices to the level where applicants and citizens kind of expect with a level of transparency. Next slide.
Councilmember Larmer, do you have a question before we go further?
Yeah, so going back to the changes to the hearing, how much public comment do we typically get at a hearing today?
Most of our hearings are not attended by any members of the public. Very, very, very infrequently. We do have hearings for full plats, and those would still have a hearing. I would say of the permits that we have people who attend, those will still have hearings. The ones that won't have hearings will be ones that we get a lot less of. For CUPs, for example, a wireless tower. We have wireless towers right now go through a full hearing and a CUP. And I also think that it's just a lot of the applications that we don't get applications for because the hearing is a barrier. Special home occupations are one of those. So if you want to tutor children in your home and you want to have more than the number that's allowed by code, you technically need to have a hearing in order to do that. So to answer your question, we're not really seeing any comments or any people showing up for the types of CUPs that we would be moving down to the administrative level. And that was part of the analysis for choosing them to be administrative.
So that's just what I wanted to clarify, is that we're not necessarily taking away an avenue for public comment because it's not really being used today, it sounds like.
No, and the same mechanism for public comment where you would be able to call or email or talk to the planner or send in a physical comment. That same comment period will still exist. It'll just be there just won't be the at the very end, the hearing and the ability to comment at a hearing.
Okay, thank you very much.
No, of course.
Thank you.
And so lastly is the consistency piece. So this is not super exciting. As with every code amendment we do, we always find some things that need to be updated. You'll even probably would have caught my error in the presentation here. In our code, we actually refer to the ECD director as the planning director and the community development director. He is the director of all names. So that's some of the inconsistencies that we're cleaning up, would be the references to outdated position titles. We have some outdated fees and incorrect timelines. So next slide. That concludes my presentation. I'm available for more questions as well.
All right, thanks, Kaelene. It sounds like just some updating that needs to be done and streamlining the process. Are there any questions about this?
Council President.
Oh yes, Councilmember Michaud.
Thank you. Kaelene, I didn't see any mention in the ordinance about what size the signs are.
Yes, so we didn't codify the size of the sign because we're actually working with multimedia right now to create a document for us. We think we're going to keep the sign around the same size it is now, but didn't codify it so that we have the ability to change it. There also will be some material changes. So we're working with staff internally with staff right now to identify the new material for the board and how it would be affixed. We're thinking it would be about a 2 foot tall by 3 to 4 foot wide, so similar in size to now.
And then also, I didn't see anything in the ordinance about putting the info on the city website.
There should be a portion in there where just in the general NOA section. So we already post the NOAs on site and in the newspaper. And so in the same section where we codify putting it in the newspaper, I also added the term online in there. So that would just be an additional piece to what we're already doing. So we'll do that as well.
Councilmember Thomas.
Thank you, Madam President. I just wanted to say this is something that really has been needed for a long time, and I just want to appreciate your work on this.
Thank you.
Thanks, Councilmember Thomas. Any other questions? All right, so the motion before us is the ordinance adopting the process updates to the Kent City Code chapters 12 and 15. Are there any objections? All right, we will move that forward to the consent calendar. Thank you so much, everyone. My apologies for those of you that are following along, and to Sam in particular. We need to go back to item number 5. So Sam, would you like to present on the comprehensive plan land use map update? And I apologize.
I would be happy to, no worries at all. I guess starting from the top, I'm Sam Alcorn, current planner here with the City of Kent. Every year, the city receives applications to amend the comprehensive plan's land use map. This year, we received 3 by the September 1st, 2019 deadline. And state law requires that we review all of these applications together so that we can consider the cumulative effect of any of these land use changes. Next slide, please. So the proposals are listed A through B. Proposal A is a change from single family 8 units per acre to mixed use. It's 7 parcels, about 1.8 acres near Kent Meridian High School. Proposal B is a change from a medium density multifamily to mixed use. It's 2 parcels, 1.3 acres at the intersection of Kent Kangley and 116th. And proposal C is a change from single family 4.5 units per acre to a neighborhood services land use designation, 3 parcels totaling 2.4 acres near Southeast 256 and 132nd Avenue Southeast. Each of these proposals were presented to LUPD on September 28th, and LUPD unanimously voted to recommend approval of the proposed ordinance that you have today, which approves proposals A and B and denies proposal C. Next slide, please. So this is just a general map of the city with those red dots going left to right, A, B, and C, of where they're located. And so Following this, I will go over the criteria that we review comprehensive plan amendments, each proposal's current land use, proposed new land use, any relevant goals and policies in the comprehensive plan, as well as staff and LUPB's recommendations. Next slide, please. So the criteria for review, spelled out by Kent City Code 1202, are generally: one, will the land use change affect the health, safety, and welfare? Two, is there any new information since the 2015 comp plan that would influence these changes? Three, will it result in long-term benefits to the community? And four, is it consistent with the goals and policies of the comprehensive plan? Next slide, please. So starting with proposal A, like I mentioned before, currently it's designated as a single family 8 units per acre, and they are petitioning to change land use designation to mixed use. Mixed use, as it means, can allow both residential and commercial development. And you can see kind of on the bottom there, the different standards for development of that mixed use, but also mixed use will allow commercial only development. And that commercial only development could include gas stations, drive-through restaurants, as well as miscellaneous retail, personal and professional services. Next slide, please. So for this proposal, I believe, or staff believes, that it does meet a lot of the relevant goals and policies of the comprehensive plan. As to encourage, I guess if it ends up being a mixed use development, to encourage mixed use development, to locate housing near shopping, transit, human and community services. You can remember that Kaelene High School is just right north of there. The comprehensive plan wants to encourage infill development and locate some of these multifamily units or commercial uses near roads that have high levels of traffic. So next slide, please. Staff recommends approval of this application. So next slide for proposal B. This is at the intersection of Kaelene and 116th. They're changing from a medium density multifamily land use, which allows about 23 units per acre and quite a bit of multifamily housing, to again this mixed use land use designation, which can allow commercial development only. And I believe the proposal intent is to have a drive-through development locate there. The intersection on the eastern corners are also developed with drive-through uses and pretty recently developed at that. Yeah, the next slide, please. This one was a little bit less clear-cut with meeting the goals and policies of the comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan tries to limit the conversion of residential land uses into commercial land uses. It tries to promote the redevelopment of commercial areas by limiting the additional land use designation of commercial areas. But at the same time, the comprehensive plan also wants to locate commercial use around heavily trafficked intersections, and wants to try to consider neighborhood centers appropriate for convenient commercial opportunities. And this intersection is being developed currently as a bit of a commercial center. And next slide, please. Staff recommends, because of this, to approve this comprehensive plan change, mostly because of like an agglomeration of uses on this intersection. I think the commercial land use, mixed use land use could benefit from the view and exposure on a busy intersection right on the corner there, as well as not significantly detracting from the amount of residential land use that's there. So finally, moving on to proposal C, located at 256 and 132nd. They are petitioning to change from a single family housing 4.5 units per acre to a neighborhood services and rezone to neighborhood community commercial, which allows development of gas stations, convenience stores, liquor stores, daycares, as long as miscellaneous retail, that sort of thing. The applicant proposed to have a lot line adjustment to enlarge the eastern lot by moving that lot line all the way to the sides of the current residences there and preserve those residences from development. And I think their intent is to develop a gas station, convenience store, car wash. And so, next slide, please. This proposal also addresses some of the same goals and policies mentioned for that previous proposal, as far as limiting the conversion of residential uses to commercial uses, trying to promote redevelopment of commercial uses by limiting the redesignation of land as commercial, and then also asked to consider neighborhood centers where it would be appropriate to add convenient commercial opportunities, to locate housing opportunities close to employment, shopping, and community services. And so while this proposal somewhat meets some of those goals and policies, I think the big one here is that, unlike the proposal B, there's no other commercial development on this intersection. It's surrounded by kind of lower density residential development, and mainly there's already a commercially designated land 1 mile to the north and 1 mile to the south. And so keeping consistent with limiting the conversion of residential land to commercial land and trying to promote commercial redevelopment within existing commercial areas, staff and LEPB recommended to deny this proposal. And spells out a little bit of my logic there in the slide. Final slide, please. Currently, the Washington Department of Commerce is completing a mandated 60-day review of any ordinance to change land uses. And so this can't be adopted to ordinance until November 17th. However, the council can give its approval of the following ordinance. And I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you, Sam. Councilmember Thomas, you have your hand up. Do you have a question?
Yeah, just a comment. I don't have a particular problem with your proposals for B and C. Could you go back to A? That's exactly across from the entrance to Kent Meridian High School, which has got Riley's, used to be Yen Louie was across the street in that one building. You got Riley's Auto Parts down in the corner there. You went from residential to, I mean, it's already zoned for your businesses, and now you want to make it for available for housing when you got a huge apartment complex to the west of this proposal. So do you have any comments on that as far as why you want to go? I don't see residential going into that area.
Sure.
It doesn't seem to go well.
Yeah, so in the 2008 Comprehensive Plan Amendment proposals, the 4 parcels directly north of here were granted a land use change from SF8 to mixed use. And so that factors a little bit into the proposal. I think really it's considering those 4 criteria of review of does it meet the goals and policies of the comprehensive plan? I argue that it does. Does it, will it detract from the general public health, safety, and welfare? And is it going to provide some long-term benefits to the community? And I think really that promoting the infill development and mixed-use development would meet those goals.
So is it just the area in blue that I'm looking at that you're talking about?
So that's for the current application. In 2018, the 4 parcels directly to the north went through this same exact process and were granted a land use change from the single family 8 units per acre to mixed use.
To mixed use. Okay, thank you.
Sam, just to kind of piggyback on what Les was talking about, some of these proposals, you kind of have an idea of what they were looking at putting in there. Did I miss it? Did you say what they were considering for that area or not?
For this area, they are considering a mixed use development. And it's, the applicant has not proposed a commercial only development.
Okay, perfect. Council Member Michaud.
Thank you, Council President. I was asking, I wondered the same thing. I'm just a little concerned that we're taking away residential for commercial space here.
I think that is a fair concern. And with the mixed use designation, yes, it could be commercial only, but if, as the applicant is proposing to have a mixed use development, the mixed use land regulations allow for much more residential units to be put in place over the 8 individual lots that will, if the land use doesn't change, will remain as 8 individual units in perpetuity. And so I think for the change to mixed use, there's an opportunity here to create more housing than what currently is allowed.
Thank you. Councilmember Larmer.
Thank you, Council President. Sam, so I have a question. So for this proposal, we're talking about mixed use being commercial and residential, and I'm guessing that's driven based on what the applicant is proposing. But on proposal B, I think the slide said that it would be commercial only. So I'm wondering why.
Currently these are applications to change the land use. The land use options offer a variety of zones that they can also change into, which could result in a variety of development. And so the decisions today are to change what potentially could be built, not what is actually going to be built. But from the conversations I've had with the applicant, I think there is interest to have a commercial development on this corner, mostly because a very busy intersection there. One isn't particularly attractive to having residential uses right on the corner of a busy intersection. However, would be pretty attractive to commercial use to have some high visibility.
And
that arterial.
Do our city standards, like I know me on Meeker, we're now requiring that, there be that mixed use is residential on top,
yep.
Retail on the bottom or commercial on the bottom. Do we have similar design restrictions? Because I think I share my fellow council members' concerns about, how do we maximize available housing? And so is there a way to allow for commercial on the ground floor and residential above like we do in other parts of the city?
Yes, so the development regulations for that mixed use zone would allow for a development to have both commercial and residential use. I think if they chose to development with mixed uses, it limits the amount of commercial to 25% of the floor area, I believe. However, again, this isn't a decision currently on what the development will be. It's just what could potentially happen.
Thank you.
All right, Councilmember Fincher, and then we'll circle back.
That's okay. I just had my question answered. That's okay. Thank you.
Sure. Councilmember Thomas, do you have any additional questions or comments?
Just a comment on going back to Kip Meridian there on 101st Avenue. A lot of those, what I think Xandria thinks are non-commercial, are already doing some business out of the homes, like haircut, salon kind of thing. And I mean, it's not really what I would consider a residential area. You're so close to all that commercial area, and it seemed like that'd be prime for something except housing. And those houses you got there, 1 to 7, 8, I don't know, those homes, I'd have to go back and drive by there again, but I think, I don't know. Anyway, I'm just giving some comments here.
Thank you, Councilmember Thomas. Councilmember Michaud. Councilmember Fincher, did you have anything else to add?
Yeah, well, with the commercial, part of that commercial, aside from the school, there's also a couple of churches there.
That's right.
So, yeah, so that would go to maintaining the need for housing or keeping that in there also. We would not be able to mandate that if they go mixed use, that they also include housing. They could go strictly commercial, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Pardon?
So yes, that is correct. That the mixed use development regulations allow commercial only development as well as both commercial and residential mixed use.
All right, Councilmember Core.
Thank you. Sam, the question is on parcel C, I guess the plan C. This lot is being used by vendors on a weekly basis, as you know, they're trying to sell stuff out of there. So I guess my question is that, but the last comment in their recommendation, it could negatively affect the potential for redevelopment in these nearby commercial areas. What exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as some of the goals and policies of the comprehensive plan state, by designating residential land as commercial land, it allows to have an open, undeveloped parcel of land to be developed as commercial, which could potentially take away redevelopment opportunity from existing commercial parcels, which in this situation are located 1 mile to the north and 1 mile to the south.
And they haven't been developed yet?
The commercial areas to the north and south are currently developed. However, by adding commercial area to the City of Kent land uses, it could take away a redevelopment potential.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And Sam, I just want to thank you for sharing the information on the criteria that your department uses to guide, you know, through whether or not these proposals fall in with what the city's plan is. And I think it's really helpful to see that and to see how you use that criteria to make your decisions. So I support these proposals. Are there any other questions or comments from my colleagues about any of these proposals? All right, so before us, we have an ordinance for comprehensive the plan land use map update. Are there any objections to moving this forward to the calendar? Councilmember Larmer.
Thank you, Council President. I just want to clarify. So by moving forward, we're approving A and B and denying C. Is that correct? If we moving forward as written?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I have no objections on.
Okay. All right, and I'm not seeing any other hands raised, so we will move this forward to the consent calendar. Thank you so much, Sam.
You're welcome. Have a nice evening.
All right, I am going to get us back on track, and we are back to a presentation number 7, which is Matt Gilbert on the ordinance for the isolation and quarantine facility, emergency housing, and emergency shelters.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me back. I'm here this evening to propose code changes and to ask for your support related to isolation and quarantine facilities, as well as emergency housing and emergency shelters related code changes. I have about 15 slides to get through tonight, so please stop me if you have any questions. Some of this is a bit repetitive, but I think it's good for context. So as you'll recall, we talked about last time that the COVID-19 pandemic and the kind of associated economic impacts have highlighted the demand for new types of housing in Kent. It's made us kind of think about our regulations, about what might be coming to us in the wake of this pandemic and how we might want to deal with this new housing moving forward. And we need to think about our code as we do that. So in the most proximal example here, or kind of proximal event that really got us thinking, was the Assemblage. And it made us look at our code carefully and revealed some shortcomings. So really, we saw some possibilities for that site that were not specifically addressed in our zoning code, and we thought we should look closely there. So those uses included isolation and quarantine facilities, as that is, as it's been used for most recently. We thought about supportive housing, which is something that is a type of housing that we'll be likely to see more of moving forward as demand for social service-based housing increases. Also, this made us think about our emergency shelters and emergency housing regulations that were passed recently as in May 2020. Kind of as a group, these are sort of a type of housing that is not really well represented. There aren't a lot of these types of uses out there in the community. We don't think about them very often, so we're taking that opportunity right now. Next slide, please. Actually, before I move on, we can leave the slide here, but I will share with you that while we did talk about supportive housing quite a bit last time, we've been thinking more about that use in the last few weeks, and we've elected, or as we've thought about it, as we've kind of consulted with our law department and talked about it internally, it's become clear that that's a very complicated issue. There are a lot of matters of federal law that limit our that kind of limit our ability to regulate that, so we need to be very careful with it. So for the time being, we've elected to defer any regulation changes related to supportive housing to a later date. So that's a big change from last time. So we're not including that in today's recommendation. However, we are moving forward with isolation and quarantine facilities, as well as some changes to the emergency shelters and emergency housing regulations. So next slide, please. So just as a refresher, isolation and quarantine facilities are, at the local level, are kind of a new thing with COVID that we're being forced to deal with. So as we thought about this issue, we went out and looked for some literature on best practices related to these facilities, and found that really the federal government is really the only entity that has operated these facilities, usually at ports of entry, and usually related to travelers who might be bringing in some communicable diseases, or maybe you think of a plane load of people who might be infected and need to quarantine or isolate for a period of time. So there are some vague best practices, but when you really get down to the community level, what we found is that the main thing we need to think about is community safety and health. So we've structured some recommendations around that very issue. Next slide, please. So I'll reprise this graphic about who uses isolation and quarantine facilities. Now, these are public facilities, or they're available to a wide spectrum of people that might include travelers or essential workers with a high-risk person at home, people who lack permanent housing, maybe people who live in some sort of a congregate setting, or just about anyone who is not able to isolate at their own home. So there's really a wide range there. Next slide, please. So we started by defining this use, and maybe I should pause for a moment while instead of reading this to you, I'll let you just take this in for a few beats here. So you'll find it's fairly straightforward. It's a facility where people can get away from society, basically, while they wait out an infection or wait to know whether they're infectious or not. It's fairly straightforward. Next slide, please. So here I list some concerns that we've been able to generate really from firsthand experience. Often with zoning, we have to think about things sort of creatively or in a worst case scenario. But in the case of I&Q facilities, we have some firsthand experience. We've been forced to think about this, with the Econo Lodge project. And so we're very familiar with this. So our concerns are the proximity of the facility to busy areas. Again, this is a safety, sort of infection control issue. That proximity is kind of the last line of defense. If folks decide to leave, and we need to think about where they go, and if where they go is a place with a lot of other people, you could have a spread that we would want to avoid. Also, the risk of infecting first responders. We thought a lot about this with the Corona Lodge. If you consider infectious folks who have a medical issue or a need for police presence, and you could quickly spread a communicable disease to an entire fire crew or several police officers, that would you really start to create some problems there for public health, safety, and welfare. Guest services are something that are important to help people feel like they could stay there without having to leave. So meals, supplies, laundry, counseling, any kind of personal services that are necessary are important to consider. Something that Chief Padilla brought up that we've included here is the prospect of drug activity on the premises. Again, I mean, yes, we know that drugs are illegal, but the need for, if someone has a drug issue, you will have more coming and going. So it does affect the public in terms of sort of vector folks coming, kind of taking communicable disease off site. And finally, we need to think about the long-term uses of these sites. So let's go to the next slide, please. So we've crafted in the ordinance some requirements and I'll try to summarize them here. I think you have them in your packet. We will require that the operator provides security fencing and security personnel to make sure to control access to limit that to guests and to discourage guests from leaving. Now, there's sometimes so there's issues there where guests can't necessarily be forced to stay, but they can certainly be encouraged to stay. And again, a lot of these regulations are tailored to help make that easy. So as we get into the next one, meals, supplies, services, we just want people to be comfortable and not need to leave. Also, transportation. We want to make sure that operators provide for transportation, both medical and sort of when a guest needs to arrive and when a guest needs to finally leave the site, we want to make sure that the operator provides a way for them to do that. We want to make sure that the facility meets all of the relevant building codes. Basically, these need to be places that are appropriate for human habitation, which is what the building codes are centered on. As I mentioned before, we would require that these sites prohibit drug use. We would require also that a written plan be submitted by the operators that detail how they intend to meet the various requirements, and that they also provide us with contacts. Something I don't mention in the slide here is that we would require a conditional use permit if an INQ facility needed to operate for more than 180 days. Now, because we recognize that in a pandemic situation, or if there's an outbreak of COVID again or some other contagious disease in the future, there is a need to open these facilities quickly. So we've written in a provision where a facility could open quickly as long as it was in an allowed zone under a temporary use permit. And that's important because conditional use permits take usually several weeks to obtain, whereas a temporary use permit can be obtained more quickly. And you'll recall Kaelene Nobis's presentation where she talked about how long a conditional use permit can take, and it's a lot of money and time, et cetera. We would require the full hearing in this case, but we want to make sure that if there is an emergency, that the facility can get up and running quickly as long as they meet all of the relevant requirements. So finally, this is probably one of the bigger elements here, is that we would propose that INQ facilities be limited to the industrial zones of the city. And that's really those are the zones where we have buildings. There are places where these could locate, but they are the most remote from active areas of the city, which would help protect public safety. Next slide, please. So here's a zoning map. The I zones, they're in the industrial zones, are there in the center of the valley. You're probably familiar. The I1, I2, and I3, the gray, blue, light gray, gray, and blue zones. There is a sliver on Central Avenue, and there's also the industrial area there in the Horseshoe Bend area. But we feel that this zoning designation should be effective in isolating these uses. So this might be a good time to pause for questions before we shift gears into the next topic. Can I answer any questions at this point?
Councilmember Boyce, you have your mic off.
Hey man, I like the zoning area that we put them in. I guess one thing around, discourage them from leaving. I mean, I'm not sure we can do anything stronger than that because we have incident where we have security. People still left, went to the store across the street, hop on the bus. So I don't know how we can make that any stronger, but I mean, I just don't feel good about it, but maybe it could be, it is what it is. So
yeah. I think what we've tried to construct this in a way where there's multiple layers of protection. Maybe you have a security guard who's saying, hey, you know, where are you going? Can I get you anything? You know, what can we do to keep you here? You know, we have provisions there for all the services that they might need. Of course, you can't hold people against their will, but then the zoning becomes another layer that might help protect the public from an infectious person walking around.
All right, any other questions for Matt at this point? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands raised.
Okay, great. I'll keep going. So next slide, please, Kim. Thank you. So emergency housing and emergency shelters, you'll recall, were taken up in May of 2020 in response to some state legislation that basically required that we have a lot of regulations in place about how these emergency housing and shelters can operate. So we did some quick work there. Again, since we've been re-examining the housing types in the city, we thought maybe there might be some appropriate tweaks to make here. So you might not recall, so I'll refresh you that an emergency shelter is distinct from emergency housing in that it's not a permanent building and it's not served by permanent utilities. Just for a mental image, you might think of something like a tent city or something along those lines. That's not a permanent structure. Whereas emergency housing is a similar type of use, but it's located in a permanent building. Both of these types of uses, I think, are characterized best in that they are allowed to operate for 90 days on and 90 days off. They also require extensive operational limitations. There's a requirement that they are that the operators enter into an operating agreement with the city. So the city has a lot of involvement with these, and there are a lot of protections in place. So let's go to the next slide, please. So we're focusing in this recommendation on the zones where these uses are allowed, and I'll get to that more in a minute. So currently, emergency housing and shelters can be located in our multifamily zones. That is MRD, MRG, MRM, and MRH. And I'll show you the zoning map in a moment just to make those words mean something. The main difference is that in those zones, emergency housing and shelters need to be affiliated with a church. So that affiliation helps to bring some local accountability and is also, frankly, something that we need to do because feeding the hungry and taking in the homeless is the part of many church, and I say church, I mean religious institutions. This is inclusive of all religions, but those ministries are part of many religious institutions' mission. So that's something that we allow, that we encourage, that we have in place. So we also need to have a provision when a provider wants to do a similar type of housing without affiliating with a church. And so the code currently limits that use to emergency housing and allows emergency housing in commercial and industrial zones. So if you're with the church, you can be in the multifamily zones, either housing or shelters. And if you're not with the church, you can do housing. That's the fixed in a building type of variety in a commercial or industrial zone. So that, again, that was passed in May of 2020 and is currently on the books. Both require conditional use permits. As I said before, there's operating agreement requirements, the 90-day on, 90-day off limitation, and lots of other requirements. So let's go to the next slide, please. So at the time these were passed, as I understand, there wasn't a lot of sort of in-depth consideration given to the locational requirements. Emergency housing and shelters had been allowed in the zones they're allowed in now for a long time. Basically what the May 2020 legislation did was add a lot of additional requirements to the operations of those. However, as I said, as we're thinking about where certain uses go in the city and the fact that the demand may grow, it's a good time to think about locations. So in this proposal, we would suggest that this is a housing use. You know, emergency housing is typically, you know, it's short term typically, but it's a housing use. And we're proposing that these uses be limited to zones that allow housing. So we thought that would be more in keeping with the city's goals and visions, that we incorporate this into that larger definition or milieu of housing. So we don't allow housing with a few minor exceptions in the GC zone or in a lot of our commercial zones, as well as the industrial zones. So we're proposing that the emergency housing not be allowed in those, that we amend the code to make sure that it is only allowed in zones that allow housing. So that's really the crux of this part of the proposal. I will also point out that in the May 2020 legislation, there was a clause there that indicated that existing shelters not be impacted by that legislation, which that would continue to be in place. You know, we have a lot, we have, especially in the downtown area, the rotating shelters, et cetera, those are carved out from the legislation in May, and that again would continue. Let's go to the next slide, please. So here is, again, the zoning map. I was telling you that the MRD, MRM, MRG, and MRH zones currently allow emergency housing and emergency shelters. You see those zones in, I think it's the brown hues that represent those zones. Of course, the DCE zone allows housing. The midway zones around the Kent Des Moines interchange also allow housing. So that our proposal would be to limit the emergency housing to those zones. So that is all I had planned to say. I'm of course happy to answer questions. Oh, I do suppose I neglected to tell you that we had a public hearing on this last night before the Land Use and Planning Board, who we had a good discussion about this, and they unanimously supported it with no changes. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, any additional questions for Matt? And just a reminder, the ordinance before us is specific to the isolation and quarantine facilities, emergency housing, and emergency shelters. Councilmember Boyce.
Yes, good job, Matt. So assuming it goes through the council, the 20th, what's the effective date on this year? What would it be? Would it be the first of the year? Do we know?
It would be a 30-day ordinance. So around November 20th or so, I'd have to do the math, but right there.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any other questions or comments for Matt?
I'm sorry, Madam President. So some of the existing place where we have the Carnage in place today, right? So how would that be grandfather in, or how would that particular place fit in this equation?
No, it would not. That's, you know, the county has used that, as you know, as an isolation and quarantine facility, and they are operating currently under an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, that was, you know, the result of us taking them to court, where they had pledged to operate that consistent with the city's zoning laws when the pandemic emergency was over. So this legislation would not allow isolation and quarantine facilities in the future at that location.
All right, anybody have any other questions for Matt? So the ordinance before us is, again, for the isolation, quarantine facility, emergency housing, emergency shelters. Is there any objection to moving this forward to the consent calendar? All right, I'm not seeing any, so we will move it forward. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Okay, moving on in the agenda, we are on item number 8. So Michelle Ferguson, you're going to talk about some additional CARES money.
Hi, good evening, Council. I'm Michelle Ferguson, the Financial Planning Manager. I am bringing forth an amendment for the interagency agreement with the Washington Department of Commerce for coronavirus relief funds for local governments. Next slide. There you go. On June 2nd, 2020, the Council approved the interagency agreement with the Department of Commerce in the amount of $3,894,000 for costs incurred due to the public health emergency with respect to the coronavirus disease 2019 for the period of March 1st through October 31st, 2020. This interagency agreement needs to be amended because the Department of Commerce has increased the City of Kent's award amount by $1,947,000 for a total amount of $5,841,000. And the contract deadline has been extended to November 30th, 2020. Anticipated awards for the additional funds include a grant to the Kent Downtown Partnership to include outdoor equipment for use by downtown businesses to increase capacity for outdoor dining and retailing, and a contract with Multi-Service Center to operate a utility grant assistance program to aid utility customers who have been financially impacted by COVID-19. We have been working with Commerce to get these programs underway and are currently working to finalize the applicable contracts. While not anticipated at this time, additional CARES Act funds may become available. The motion includes language that will authorize the mayor to approve and sign contracts related to CARES funding. Due to the tight time frame we are working with for this agreement, we want to make sure there are no bottlenecks, and authorizing the mayor to sign contracts like the one we are entering in with the Kent Downtown Partnership will help expedite the process. So this is a very high level view of what the CARES funding will be used to purchase. The guidance from the Treasury and the state have been ever evolving. The newest guidance was distributed from Commerce just last Thursday. We've originally planned to use CARES funding to pay for a couple of purchases that were capital related expenditures, but now based on the new guidance and out of an abundance of caution, we plan to pay for those purchases out of the general fund and then request CARES reimbursement for additional general fund public safety payroll expenses in order to have no effect on the general fund and use all of the funds we have been awarded.
Well, I've got a couple of hands raised really quickly. I'm going to start with Councilmember Murray.
Thank you. Yeah, so I just wanted to find, so of the 2.1 million for economic support, that included our small business grant program, is that correct?
Yes, so about 2 million for the small business grants, and then another 150 or so for the Kent Downtown Partnership, which it's going to be closer to 175, probably when it's all said and done.
Okay, and what is the signage for 175?
So this is one of those kind of capital expenditures that it's not looking like a good idea to use the CARES funding for, so we'd have to shift those costs to the general fund and then ask for more payroll expenses to be submitted on here. But the plan is 4th and Willis, the new roundabout that they're building there, to put in a large reader board that could, remind people to wash their hands and, say where they can get more information or testing or things like that. So most of that signage would be for that, but then other signage around the city buildings as well.
Okay, will the proposal for that roundabout signage be coming to council? I kind of need to see what that looks like. I just imagine a big glaring sign.
It's a digital reader board, so I'm not sure if that is coming to council or not. Derek, do you know?
The change order doesn't need to come before council because of the amount, but we'd be happy to include a presentation at an upcoming committee meeting to kind of walk you through where that's placed and how it looks visually.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So, okay, thank you.
Derek, and I think that would really help. I've heard a little bit about it. I think it sounds really cool. It's a really neat opportunity, a tool for our city to have. So maybe just highlighting some of the things that it will be used for my colleagues to see would be a good idea. Councilmember Kaur.
Thank you. Michelle, do you have the list of funding where we've spent it in the past? Because council hasn't seen how the money was spent so far on the CARES funding. and 800,000 for other. I mean, we need to be very specific about where are we spending this money. It seems to be just, and 460,000 for shower supplies. What exactly are we buying for shower $460,000?
So far, 2.85-ish has been charged directly to this project that's holding all of these costs in there so far. So the 800,000 is just kind of a placeholder for things that could be coming in the future. I know there's been talk about, touchless toilets and things like that, but they haven't been charged to the project yet. So I can provide a list of what's been charged to the project so far for the 2.8.
That would be great. I would like to see that. And we have spent money on sending mailers to people's homes and businesses.
Yes,
how much did we spend on that? And the billboards are putting around the city, but when we have small businesses applying for grants, we seem to run out of money for them. So I'd like to see more money going directly to our businesses and our residents with rental housing assistance instead of spending it on things that we think are good for city to have or help us, because at this time we're getting this money to support us in some of the buying laptops for our staff or buying hand sanitizer and masks, but probably not for just marketing or for putting logo on masks. I mean, that's not a good use of taxpayer money coming back to our community. So I would really like to see where we have spent this money so far, how it's being charged, and where exactly do we plan on spending it in the future. So I don't feel comfortable approving this until I see how we have spent it. Thank you.
Did you want me to just later on talk about the showware proposed equipment, or go through that now?
If you have it, that would be great. I'd like to see that, because I'm just curious, because so far we haven't seen, at least I haven't seen any updates come through on how we have spent this money, except for the small business grant or the money we give to our nonprofit partners to provide for rental assistance. And that doesn't seem a lot of money going to them, looking at how much we're spending on 800,000 being put in other, or signage, or that sort of. I mean, 100,000 might be a small amount of money in this whole fraction and looking at the number, but it could mean a lot to a couple of businesses. So just kind of my point of view there. And yes, if you have the list of expenses or where we're planning on spending, I would love to see that. But I would not be willing to approve this until we know how we're spending the money, because I can't do that personally. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Councilmember Kaur. I think, Michelle, I think if you can provide some of the breakdowns, that would be very helpful. Something that we have to remember is that, Kent is a very large city. We have businesses, we have residents, we have different needs that I feel like are kind of being captured here. It's taking this money and using it the way we see best across our entire community. And I just think some of the things we have done, just looking at the comments from, social media, people who have showed up at our events where we've given out things, people are taking advantage of the utility assistance program. And, the ability for us to give out more CARES money to small businesses has been helpful. But I get it. It's trying to figure out that balance and making sure that we're reaching our entire community. And I think so far we've done a good job, but I think maybe seeing that breakdown would be really helpful.
And just to point out, the rental assistance, that is coming from a different pot of CARES funding that the Parks Group Human Services is managing. So it's not included in this use of funds.
Thank you for that, Michelle. Councilmember Fincher.
Thank you. With that other pot of money, I think there's going to be a larger need than that money is going to be fixing once that moratorium ends and people have rent payments to make up. But my question is about the $175,000 for signage. There were, I thought there were going to be 2 reader boards at 4th and Willis. Is this part of that? Is this paying for part of that? Or is this a totally different reader board?
This is for one reader board at 4th and Willis. Derek, do you have more information on this one?
Yeah, I believe 150,000 is for one reader board in each direction on Willis Street at approximately 5th Avenue South. And then I think there's about 25,000 just earmarked for signage around city buildings, especially as we reopen.
Okay, so these are the two that reader boards that we had talked about.
Correct.
Thank you.
So Michelle, I have a question about the ordinance here that we're looking at. Is there a time frame that this needs to be accepted? Because I know there's a window, you know, until the end of November. I just want to make sure, and we're not necessarily, I don't think right now we're discussing how the money gets spent. I mean, I know it says it authorizes the mayor, but she's also been very open, and you have been very good at communicating where that money's been spent. I just want to make sure that there's not a time frame where we have to make sure we get through this evening. I want to make sure we're respectful of that, so we don't miss out on something.
I have not been told a time frame by Commerce of when we need to have the agreement signed and back to them. I just know that we have a hard deadline of any costs incurred have to be spent by November 30th. And without knowing if we have that extra $1.9 million, it's going to be hard to move forward with a whole lot of other purchases if we don't know if we're going to get that money or not.
Okay, thank you so much for clarifying that. Councilmember Boyce.
Thank you, Madam President. We definitely don't want to miss out on the money, right? The funding, right? And I think there's this a big bucket of money. You know, I think if you break it out in percentage, I mean, it may not look as bad as a dollar value for us, you know, how this money being spent. I know I talked to quite a few small business and they've been very appreciative of the CARES Fund and really have helped them out. So, you know, and I don't know whether we do it tonight or at another meeting, along with it, break it out into percentage because, you know, in the scheme of things, when you look at this big pot of money, well, 175,000 could be only maybe 3% of the bucket, right? So I strongly believe that, you know, yes, you know, we need to take care of our own, but also I think there's some things that we continue to need to do as a city, like other cities have done with this CARES money to continue to, you know, encourage people, whatever it takes to want to live in Kent, stay in Kent, shop in Kent. So I will recommend maybe if you want to break out percentage, it may not look as bad as the dollar amount. Just my 2 cents.
Okay. Councilmember Lerner.
Thank you. Michelle, you said something that just sparked another question for me. So you talked about we have to spend this money by November 30th.
Yes, we do.
So how are we, okay, so how do we handle things like the utility assistance or the economic support? I mean, like
so the economic support has basically been expended. We've already spent 1.95 on it so far, and then we're in the process of making sure the Kent Downtown Partnership gets a check in the next coming days. I think on Thursday, they can get their money to buy the tents for the outdoor eating establishments. For the utility customer assistance, unfortunately, it takes quite a while working with Commerce and an agency to be able to get these programs up and running. So the utility customer service is not up and running yet, and we're hoping to have it soon. And that's why it's only $100,000. If we had more time, we definitely would be able to help more residents. But as of right now, it's assuming that we're only gonna be able to help about 60 just with the shortened time frame that we have.
So essentially that other 800,000, I mean, at this point, because we don't have time to stand up a program, it's going to have to be some sort of physical expense. Is that what I'm understanding?
Right. If we can't come up with something in the next 6 weeks, it has to be either purchased and, you know, installed, or, I mean, that cutoff is a very finite, there's no way around it. And we have to have all expenditures into Commerce by December 15th as well. So it's not like we can kind of fudge it either. It's a very tight turnaround.
Okay, and that money was not distributed as part of the small business grant because prior to this, because why?
I think there was an extra 634 that was given to the economic support once we knew we were going to get this extra $1.9 million. Because it was originally, when we went to council on June 2nd, we originally were earmarking $1 million for economic support. And then, and then we went up to 1.5, and then once we knew we got more money, additional was added to it.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions for Michelle? All right, so I know Councilmember Boyce, you asked for seeing kind of a breakdown of percentages of this. Councilmember Core, you asked for, you asked to see kind of another breakdown for this. So I kind of want to see where we are moving this forward. Also, just a reminder, you know, when it came to that CARES money, all the applicants that applied for that did get funding. So as far if they qualified, meeting the criteria. So I think that's just, you know, something to keep in mind, that when that money was distributed, we did have the opportunity to give it to all the businesses and extend out that money prior to the first round that was given away. So, so before us, we have the to amend the interagency agreement with Washington State Department of Commerce for the CARES funds, to accept this additional money and authorize the mayor to spend that. Are there any objections to moving this forward, knowing that Michelle's going to get back to us with some of that additional information? Councilmember Larmer.
Just a question. So is there a way to amend the motion, sorry, the ordinance? Is there a way to amend that to like add like pending a full, you know, pending a full review of expenses, or some way to amend it so we can move forward tonight and still get the money, but still get that full list of expenses? Looks like Derek has an answer. Maybe.
I'm sorry, so you're asking to change the way it's written?
Yes, my question, I guess to Derek, is there a way to
change
tonight?
I think what you could do is move forward to the consent calendar, the first half of the motion, and that's to authorize the amendment with Commerce so that we can access the 1.947 million, and then ask staff to come back to the next committee of the whole meeting with that additional information. And then the second half of that motion, which is authorizing the mayor to approve and sign contracts, etc.
I think that sounds acceptable. Are there any objections to that, or does anyone have any comments on moving forward that first part?
Madam President, so Derek, I mean, I think if we look at the economic support, the payroll expense, technology upgrade, PPE, and the utility system, I don't think there's any question around that from my peers. I don't think, right? So to me, I think there was a question around others, what that is. There's a question around the signage, and then the showware. What I think what may need to be done is just have those three items kind of get more information from the council. I mean, if I'm wrong, please correct me, but I thought that's what Councilmembers Core and Larmer was questioning more so the last three. I mean, I think the other one is pretty clear on what we have done with the funding. And if I'm wrong, somebody please correct me.
All right, Councilmember Core.
I'd actually like to see the breakdown of all the funding that's been used. I'd like to see how it was spent, what it was spent on, because I know Council President talks about transparency. I haven't seen transparency in this process. I really haven't. So I would like to see how this money was spent. We gave Mayor authorization to approve all the contracts. So she did, and she and the staff did what they thought was best, but I didn't feel like that was the best use of the funds. It's not free money, as you say. It's free money. It's taxpayer money. We paid taxes to federal government. It's coming back to us. It's still our money. And I'd like to see how we spent it and how the decisions were made on where to spend it. I'd like to see that before I give Mayor authorization to approve these funds. it might feel like a small percentage of funds to some people. It's still a big number. And the whole point, council is here to make those decisions, to make sure the money is spent. You know, we're spending it wisely. We're spending taxpayers' dollars wisely. And CARES funding is so important to our community. People are struggling, businesses are struggling. So it's not free money. It's our money coming back to us. So I would like to see the breakdown of how the money was spent. And the reason for my questions is because all of Kent residents receive these huge postcards, and the businesses received postcards. And then we have billboards on James and all city locations with huge signage. And I want to see, I get it, you're trying to encourage people to wear masks and you know, trying to be safe, but I still like to see, you know, if the money was spent the way it was supposed to be spent, and if it was used wisely. So I would still like to see the breakdown of this, and I'd be okay with approving the first part of accepting additional funding, but I'm not okay with the second part. So I still want to see that. That's my concern. Thank you.
Yeah, Councilman McCord, just a clarification. So this 5.8, so you want to see a breakout of all of these, or what you're asking for? Because we know what the PP is, at least I do. We was also part of the 2.1 that we gave to the business. We was part of that conversation. And we also so I'm just trying to understand, what are you asking for?
I'm asking for how the fund, all of the funds, the PPE bucket, what did it include? Did it include just the masks, or did it also include the, you know, the putting City of Kent logos on the masks in there, or what else was included in PPE? I still want to see that. I mean, that's the whole point of being on the council. Look, you know, you are supposed to look at how the money is spent. And so, you know, I want to see how that money was spent. I want to see, we gave the mayor authorization, but we never got back how the funds were spent. I'd like to see that.
Okay.
Yes, it's a lot, but yes, accounting has record of it. So it should just be fairly easy for them to provide it to us.
So just to be clear, you are okay moving this this first portion through. So we are okay with authorizing to accept the money. Is that where we are, Derek? And then we can come back with that second piece of it once we get a little bit more information from Michelle.
Yes, that was my suggestion, to move forward to the consent calendar next week, everything up until the comma after commerce. So authorize the mayor to sign an amendment to the interagency agreement with the Washington Department of Commerce to accept additional CARES Act funds in the amount of $1.947 million, and any similar agreements necessary to accept additional CARES Act funds from Commerce, period.
All right, so are there any objections to moving that forward? Okay, so we will move that piece back forward to the consent calendar, and then Michelle will work on getting us a breakdown and maybe providing those percentages so that we can see how it looks in a different way. Does anyone have any other additional comments or questions, or any requests on this? Okay, I am not seeing any, so we will move that first portion through, and then we will move on in the agenda. And that brings us to item number 9, which is payment of bills, which everyone receives that email. So we will move that onto the consent calendar. And then that brings us to the end of our meeting this evening. So thank you to everyone that had joined us. Great conversation again to my colleagues. It's been a windy day today, so stay safe, take care everyone, and have a good evening. We are adjourned.
Cleanliness in the workplace.